We're looking at two different reads right now on Jesus' words in Matthew 26, where he says, "Take and eat, this is my body," referring to some bread that he's got there, or "Drink from it," referring to a cup. "All of you, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." We're trying to figure out whether he is literally saying, "This is my body and this is my blood," and that this is a repeatable miracle that happens throughout history when the priest prays over the elements of communion, or whether Jesus is using a very sharp metaphor where he is saying, "This is my body and this is my blood," in some more symbolic sense. So yesterday and now also today, we're working on trying to understand more about why the people who think this is a symbolic, metaphorical remark think about that the way they do. At this time, I'm going to have my friend Jeffrey play some lovely music, and then we're going to pick up where we left off. I know we are getting way deeper into the deep water of theology than a lot of times we get, and we're bouncing around between texts a lot more than we usually do. Part of the fun of this whole thing is we just go right through a book of the Bible, but this is really important. And okay, look, yeah, I have an agenda here. Part of my agenda is that Christians have cannibalized each other, no pun intended, over this particular issue for a long time. So the reason that I took two conversations on the real presence view, the reason I'm taking two conversations here is I'm just trying to steel man both positions as best as I can. I'm trying to disclose my biases, my understanding of the thing. And I'm hoping that this little conversation, this little interlude inspired by Matthew 26, will just make everybody, outsiders, high church people, symbolic communion people, more empathetic to each other, more understanding of how other people could see things the way they see it, and maybe even more open-minded to where the text actually takes us as opposed to our presuppositions. Remember, the objective of the exercise is not to get you to think exactly my version of Christianity. I'm always thinking about this and growing and processing it. Going through the book of Matthew has changed me. I didn't write this before we all sat down and then just dictate it to you starting 3 years ago. I'm going through this too, and it's affecting me too. So my understandings of the whole thing are different than they were, whatever it's been now, almost 3 years ago when we started this together. That process of being open and receptive to the story and where the story takes us is way, way more important to me than getting you all to think whatever my exact permutation of Christianity was in October of 2019 when I started this. There is one more element to this debate that we got to talk about, though, in order to understand where people are coming from, and that is church tradition and the writings of those prominent early Christians who were around way back in the first few centuries. And both sides of this conversation, I think, have an inflated and selective view of what they think the consensus of the church fathers is. There is indeed language from early Christian leaders who were trained by somebody who was trained by somebody who's straight up in the Bible. So, I mean, we're talking like they were really close to the people who were in the New Testament. The big names, Origen, Ignatius, Irenaeus, Augustine, they all had things to say about this. In my estimation, and I had to read just about every last word of this that is still around in the course of my education, that does not make me an expert on the church fathers, but hey, I've actually also set eyes on all of this stuff in context at some point or another. Did I understand it completely? Well, no. I mean, these people are way smarter than me, but you know, I've at least read the material is the point. And as I read through this material, I felt like everybody up to Augustine, who was really prominent in the early 400s AD, so it's a long time after the fact, I felt like prior to Augustine, there wasn't quite the clarity and certainty, the forceful language regarding the real presence literal position that you get from the writings of Augustine, but also Augustine just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. There's so much there, and he thought more than one thing, much like me and you, over the course of his life. And because he wrote so much, we get to see an Augustine who evolves and who is responding to certain controversies. And so I feel like we get a really good cross-section of him. The earlier prominent Christian authors, at times it sounds like they could be interpreted as talking about real presence, But at other times, it sounds like they're really overtly talking about a symbolic understanding of all of this. The language of symbol, symbolic, remembrance, spiritual nourishment, representation, that's all over the church fathers as well. I think what is inarguable, though, is that by the time of Augustine, at the very latest, there was a strong growing consensus that this real presence view was the right understanding. But even by then, there were still people who saw that very differently and who were in very prominent positions of theological leadership. In the 9th century, two monks famously squared off in a debate that captured the minds of the whole Western theological world, a guy named Radbertus and a guy named Remembrance. And Radbertus held the position of real presence, like that's actually the body and blood upon the prayer of consecration. That's what happens. That's what Jesus meant in Matthew 26. Remembrance, who was enlisted in the debate by King Charles II, that's Charles the Bald. Obviously, I've got an empathetic soft spot with that guy, so take that into account. Maybe that influences where I come down on all of this. But Remembrance argued that though Christ is somehow mystically present in the elements, that is not, in fact, his literal body and blood in any kind of physical or metaphysical way. And they did not settle it. From the time those two started debating it until the time that the Western Church settled the argument officially was like about the amount of time that the United States has existed. So this was not a short debate. Think about that time frame and how many ideas have come and gone and been hotly contested over that time. This is something that really got worked through, and a lot of people in that time landed on the side of the more symbolic interpretation of Jesus' words in Matthew 26. But ultimately, the final acceptance of Radbertus's view of the real presence was accepted in 1215. And like now we're getting into like Braveheart kind of era. So now like when it's finally resolved, you're talking about 400-ish years of debate later that this gets formally officialized in Rome at a council at the Pope's home church, St. John Lateran. Really, neither of those guys completely aligned in their interpretation, though, with most Protestants post 1517. And so I say that just to acknowledge that there are shades of gray between the full real presence position and the Calvinesque Presbyterian symbolic position. If you think the kingdom thing makes sense and you think the Jesus thing makes sense and this is something you care about and you're into, that's one of those concepts that's just worth working through on your own, doing a little more homework on, thinking it through and processing it through carefully. I am absolutely persuaded by my read on the Bible that there is a thing called intellectual grace. I don't know if that's an actual term, but it's my term. Obviously, in order for God to make imperfect people into kingdom citizens, it means that God must have some kind of mechanism for intellectual forgiveness, for cutting people some slack for just being wrong, whether it's with the best of intentions or whether it's wrong because of unseen, selfish, flawed character motives. Either way, the whole Jesus cross thing has got to be able to deal with the flaws of the mind and the flaws of assent and the flaws of what narrative or theology that we buy into to some extent, because I promise you, like, everybody's wrong about something. So there we go. What we can say for sure is that Christians throughout the centuries have held largely to one of two views, one being that there is a literal transformation of the body and blood that occurs, and that Jesus was being absolutely literal in saying, this is my body and this is my blood, and that there is therefore something very spiritually important and nourishing about taking communion, because like an actual thing is happening as you are actually ingesting the body and blood of Jesus. What we can say for sure is that there is another thread of historical Orthodox Christianity that says, nope, that's symbolic and it's an incredibly powerful thing. And it is a stark reminder, even a physical expression of a spiritual reality that is the most profound of spiritual realities, on which people's hope in God rests, and no literal transformation occurs. And Jesus is using a very pointed metaphor when he uses this language in Matthew 26. The other thing that I think we can say for sure is that what Jesus is doing here at the Passover meal is he's saying, hey, this old meal that was celebrated once a year to remind people of God's mastery of death and life, his control over those things, his role as judge and his grace and his mercy and his power, all of that stuff is something that now is instituted in the new family of faith. There's a new feast, and this feast is to be taken whenever, as often as you take this, and it's to be done in remembrance of him, which is, of course, language that people interpret Jesus' words to be symbolic, really, really latch onto, the in remembrance of me part. I think it is awesome that we can be a community of people who hang out together on the internet and do not think all the same things and can try to be charitable and thoughtful about why not everyone on this planet thinks the exact same thing that we happen to think in this exact moment. And so thank you for your grace with me as I tread into places that I know can get you into hot water and can make people upset. I've received nothing but really gracious, charitable, cool feedback on this. And thank you for that. That rewards me for taking the risk of talking about hard things and encourages me to continue to take such risks. You're also welcome to yell at me. That's okay too. I appreciate you all so much. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.